There's a bunch of stuff we can't talk about today, and this is some of it. One of my problems is, I love the theory behind this, I could talk all day on it, but actually what always interests me most is what we can do with it, what you can do with it, how we can put it into action. So these are the topics. If you stop me at lunchtime or at coffee breaks, or even for a beer this evening before I head to the airport, I will talk to your heart's content, well no, beyond your heart's content, to my heart's content, about these until you are bored. Okay? But we're not going to touch on these today. Instead, I'm going to give you a relatively short peek, just a glimpse into the world of what we can do with this and what other people have done with this already. Okay? It's only a little peek, we can't take much more than that. So, this is a technique, the micro-narratives are the short stories. They're the fragments of meaning that we as human beings use to make sense of our world. And that's what we gather. And these are the places so far. It's a fairly new technique. I've used it for about 5 years, growing in where we use it. So some of our colleagues in UNDP and in UNICEF and the ILO have used it. That's the green ones. We ran a project last year, and in fact we're thinking about running it again this year, called Fragments of Impact, which was bringing multiple agencies together to get experience of it at low cost and in non-perfect framework. Other people, a number of these, like the Kyrgyzstan and the Georgia and Jordan projects, were tailor-made for that project. We're thinking about running that again, depending on if people are interested. So if you're interested in doing more after this, then come talk. Now, there is science behind why we do it this way. And we're going to get through the science quite quickly. It's like a sticking plaster. If you pull it quickly, it hurts less. The same goes for the science. So the first piece of science is around cognitive neuroscience, how our brains actually work. We've learned more in the last 10 years than we ever knew before. So I have some bad news. As human beings, our brains, our minds, our intelligences, we don't process information rationally and come out with good conclusions and good decisions. As human beings, one of the we have all sorts of elements to us. Our bodies are actually involved in our decision making. Our environment is involved, our tools are used, and they reshape how we see the world. But in essence, as human beings, and this goes back millennia, this is evolutionary. Evolution has taught us we take in a small amount of data in front of us. At best, if we are focusing, it is 5% of the data available to us at any one moment. And we match it against patterns in our brain. And the minute we hit a pattern that goes, that's it, we've made our decision. Now, that's bad enough, but there's worse news. We don't look for a best fit pattern match, we look for a first fit pattern match. Okay? We do it all the time. It's what in Afghanistan was really difficult with, say, patrols going out. If on day one they go out, they see certain signs. Classic ones are things like the three-legged dog and elements on things hung on telephone wires. And within 10 minutes they're in an ambush. The next day they go out, they see a three-legged dog. They're already anticipating the ambush and reacting before it's happened, despite the fact it might be a very different environment today. They're picking up certain signals because they're only scanning a small amount of it. It's what we do as human beings. If you're interested, there's an excellent book on this called by Gary Klein, Sources of Power. It's one of those books where I typically read before I go to sleep. I had to stop reading that one before I go to sleep because I'd read a bit and I'd go, oh, but hang on, that means, and then I wouldn't sleep for about 3 hours because it was just setting off neurons. Okay? So that's one of the places we go for the science on this. The other one, which actually is relevant to the conversation we were having just now this morning about correlation and everything else. I go to a thing, it's called complexity science. I forgot this slide. So, the reason we need to collect narratives is, remember, people's real life experiences are how they make decisions. Okay? Those patterns in our brain come partly from our own experience, but even more from the micro-narratives, the fragments of stories we've been told in our social environments since we were babies. Okay? An organizational culture is more defined by the conversations you have around the coffee machine or the water cooler than it is by many other things. Stories your grandmother would have told you will have shaped how you see the world. I have a problem with that. One of my grandmothers who I spent a lot of time with was half Scottish, half Polish Jewish. As my brother once said about her, if there was a pessimism Olympics, she wouldn't fancy her chances much. If there is a negative way of seeing the world, she has it. She could find it. And I do too. It drives my colleagues insane. I have a colleague who is half Russian and half Belarus, which frankly is not the most cheerful combination at the best of times. However, we finish a project, go out for a celebratory lunch, and I'm sitting there going, yeah, but we got that wrong. And Anna is going, can you leave it alone? Can we just celebrate? It was a brilliant project. Yeah, you're right. But next time, I can't help myself. So we need to understand the stories that people are using to filter out information. The stories that they are using to make the decisions. If we ask them straight questions for their opinions, they can give it to us, but it won't actually reflect how they're really making decisions, what they're really doing. We know this. We see it all the time. Okay? So we need to get that, we need to get their expectations, their assumptions out, which is why we go for micro-narratives. And we don't talk about stories. I will fall into that trap today, I guarantee you, but we try really hard not to. People have perceptions of what stories and storytelling is, which is, it's slightly fluffy. It's one of these things that, yeah, it's not real. It's not real data. It's not something we can work with. And respondents go, you want a story? Oh, I haven't really got any stories. If I'd said, give me a story about innovation in the UN agency, I bet half of you would have gone, yeah. But I go, give me an example. Oh, I've got an example. I couldn't tell you a story about it. So micro-narratives is what we're after. The pieces that we use. The next thing I go to is complexity science. Has anybody come across complexity science much? Excellent, I knew I could rely on some of you to do it. Now, there is a framework I use developed by Dave Snowden, who's a professor in the UK university. And it's called the Cynefin framework. Okay, so for everybody who's staring at that first word on the left and going, how on earth do you pronounce that? It's Cynefin. Okay, it's a Welsh word, so after me, ready? Cynefin. Cynefin. You're now members of a secret club who know how to pronounce it, okay? Now the Cynefin framework says there are certain ways we can look at the world. It's a way of looking at what's going on and saying, what kind of system are we looking at? Okay? There are certain things that we say are simple or obvious. Okay? So I'm going to be very careful here and not knock the machine and lose the screen again. There are certain things that happen the same way everywhere, every time. Cause and effect is apparent when it calls out. Okay? If I let go of this pen, what happens? It falls. Okay? So that's going to happen the same here in Kenya as it does in Australia and everywhere else. We can reliably work on that basis. So there is a best practice in terms of pens and falling, which is don't let go. Okay? And there are certain things that fall into that space where we know it happens the same every time. It's utterly predictable, and we can have best practice. In that world, as human beings, what we do is we sense what it is, we categorize it. Oh, it's one of those idiots who can't hold on to pens, and we respond by saying, don't drop it. Okay? It's really simple. We then have the world that we call complicated. Now this is still ordered, there is cause and there is effect, but it's usually separated. There's many things going on in between. There's time, there's space, there's processes. But it repeats and it is predictable every single time. Small differences at the start get ironed out as you go through. It doesn't matter where you are, you know what's going to happen. Okay? In this world, we need people with big brains who've done the research. So down here, I might be fixing a bicycle. The chains come off and I can handle that. Okay? Up here, it might be fixing a car. Okay? Many cars and many people are very good at that. I am not one of them. Okay? I could study, I could get good at it, but actually, it's better to go and find an expert in fixing cars who will go, it's your carburetor. I'll take your word for it. I understand the word. I've heard it many times in films. I have no idea what it looks like. On you go. You need experts for that, but an expert will know what to do. We then get to the world of chaotic. Chaotic where there is so many things happening, there is no pattern, and you just don't know what's going on. Okay? It's actually quite rare. I know it feels like it sometimes in organizations that it's quite common, but trust me, it is actually quite rare. There is no pattern to what's going on. In this world, we have to do new things to create stability first. It's take action, put a stake in the ground, let's do something. Okay? And then you get to the world, and I have a bias for this. We all have biases where we like to be, and I'll explain that in a second. My bias is for complex. Complex is the world where you have so many potential causes going on at the same time, and feedback loops and effects, going back to what Steve was saying earlier, that actually it's not predictable. There may be patterns of behavior that fall out of it, but they are emergent. It's a world we say is non-causal. Coming back to the conversation earlier. You can track back and find a cause when something has happened, but we call that retrospective coherence. Okay? I can send documents on this stuff and papers on this if you're interested afterwards. Okay? And one of it's retrospective coherence is what we do as human beings when we're in a complex environment and something bad has happened. The great example, and I recognize this is a sensitive one for some people, but the Twin Towers attack in 2001. Okay? Congressional report, they wrote a big report saying, okay, we can see what has happened here. They looked back, they found the point when actually it should have been picked up. Retrospective coherence, it made sense. They found the root cause. You know, engineers, experts love root cause. There ain't one in a complex environment. Okay? And their answer was, therefore, okay, what we now need to do is put in place a process so anybody who is taking flying lessons but doesn't seem to be interested in the landing part gets arrested early. It was one of the recommendations. Now that makes complete sense given what happened. Is it ever going to happen like that again? No. A complex environment continues to evolve and change. And in complexity, small changes at the start could produce radically different outputs at the end. We've all seen it. A project that works really well in Kyrgyzstan that we try and transplant to Georgia, and somehow it just never takes off, or worse, it has bad effects. But it worked in Kyrgyzstan. Yeah, because it fitted in Kyrgyzstan and there were cultural effects and all that kind of thing playing. It makes a real difference how you look at this stuff. So in this world, we can't predict what's going to happen. We can look and explore. Context matters, where it happens, who's doing it, how they're thinking matters. Our perspective filters on the world matter. So in this world, we talk about probe, sense, respond. You've got to try things small to explore. This is an ecosystem. How can we help it co-evolve in a more stable fashion? Now, I came many years ago. I used to work purely in private sector. I worked in-house in IT companies, where everybody studied for MBAs and they tried to make the world fit that. We have many processes and many ways of thinking about that. We have far fewer about this, but actually if you're dealing with human beings and behavior and attitudes and culture, you're here, not here. Applying these tools to problems that sit here is a mistake. Equally, so is trying this to problems that sit in here. And in any situation you find yourself, there will be elements of probably those three to start with, guaranteed. There will be certain things that are obvious. You know, put doors on buildings, things like that. One of the examples I give is, has anybody recently had a kitchen redone? Anybody done some work putting some things into their kitchen? If you do, there are certain things that are obvious. Okay, I have discovered you don't put cupboards behind doors, because then doors don't open. That's an obvious one, in retrospect. I have a very patient wife, as you can imagine. There are certain things that are complicated, okay? Plumbing and electrics, okay? I could work that out, but do you know what? I'm going to get an expert in to do that. There are certain things that are complex. What goes in what cupboard? Okay? How do you put your foodstuffs away? Okay? If anybody has ever had, I'm still in recovery. We had my in-laws come and stay with us recently. Okay? So of course, if anybody's had this experience, your in-laws come to stay, your mother-in-law cooks a meal, and you spend the next 3 weeks going, has anybody seen where that went? Because she put it back in somewhere that made complete sense to her, that's not where we keep it. Everybody has a different solution in the complex. There is a fifth domain in the middle, we call it the domain of disorder, which basically says, I don't know enough about this problem yet to work out which of these domains it sits in. Often, we're dealing with that at too big a level, too high a level of abstraction and granularity. I could talk about that for hours, but I'll skip it now. The other thing you must know about this, which is a warning. These boundaries here, if you cross them, it's okay, but it's useful to know when you've gone across them. If something is complicated but the world is changing when you start experimenting, that's okay, but it's useful to know. If we're running experiments and they're starting to see repeating results, actually we can bring it across here. We can turn it into a process in our organization. This boundary is different. This boundary we call the catastrophic cliff. Okay? If you have decided that certain things happen the same way everywhere, regardless, and you keep repeating it, and you don't notice maybe that the world is changing around you, that what you used to do no longer applies, you find yourself falling over this cliff. And your first reaction, I guarantee it, every organization I've ever seen, your first reaction is when you land in this is, go back to the rules and reinforce them harder. Yeah? We've all seen it. Okay? That pushes you further out and makes it a bigger mess. Because you haven't taken into account the world changed around you. That's a huge thing. An example, in the UK, a few years ago, some of you may know, there was a thing where newspapers were hacking into people's voicemails. Right? That was going on for years. And there was a standard practice. The newspapers had an easy, simple, best practice answer. A celebrity would come to them and say, you've hacked my voicemail. And the answer was, have some cash, sign this document, and never speak of this again. Worked for years. But they didn't notice the world was changing. The culture was changing. People were no longer tolerant of this. And eventually they had somebody come to them and say, you've hacked my phone. And they went, have some cash. And they went, no. And you could see them going, cannot process. Do not know what's going on here. Let's enforce the rules harder. Have more cash. No, I'm going public. And suddenly they're into chaos. So the warning here is, if you make things best practice, be really confident that the environment is not changing. Or if it is changing in geological timescales. It is really slow. Okay? So this is the Canadian framework. I find it really useful. I use this a lot. We used it recently in Jordan to help people understand the culture and then design interventions depending on what the problem was. Or more accurately, breaking out elements of the problem and then going from there. There's a whole process. It's a fun thing to do, and you can get a long way in a very short space of time on major problems. But that's a whole other conversation. But this is why we do SenseMaker. This is why we do the micro-narrative research. When we're in the complex space, we want to be able to make our decisions at the center, but we can't rely on the fact that we do the thinking. There just isn't enough. We don't have enough thinking power as individuals. We're all trapped in the patterns we have in our brains. So what we need to do is have everybody else do thinking. You want mass thinking in a way that allows you at the center to look at the patterns and go, I can make a decision. So when you were going around putting dots on the flip charts, I distributed the thinking to you for all of your individual micro-narratives. Okay? And I will base any decisions on the dots, and then maybe I'll look at some of the micro-narratives. So I'm distributing the thinking out there, distributing the cognition is how we describe it. The other thing about this is, of course, and this is critical, nobody has a bigger dot than anybody else. Every dot has equal value. Every voice, every story we collect, every micro-narrative we collect, has exactly the same value. So when we're gathering them from beneficiaries, and we're also getting them from government people, or from implementing partners, or from UN agencies, everybody's dot has equal value. Women and men, equal value. Now what we'll do, and we didn't do with you, is we'll collect a little bit of demographics so we can go, is this triangle different for women than for men? Is this triangle different depending on where you live? All of these elements. So it's a really easy way of looking, hang on, they see the world here, but we saw the world there. I had it in Jordan just recently. We ran a session where, having collected 2,000 micro-narratives from both young Jordanians, mostly unemployed, and Syrian refugees, we then ran a session in a room like this with NGOs and implementing partners, people who were actually beneficiaries in the room looking at the results, and then the government folk plus UNDP. The beneficiaries and the government were going, yeah, that makes sense. The implementing partners and the NGOs were going, but that doesn't reflect our experience. Well, I think they have different patterns from the people on the ground. I think the people on the ground have more authenticity in how they're describing it, and particularly if I've got beneficiaries who are going, yes, because what's going on is this. Then an NGO going, I don't really trust your data because it doesn't agree with me. Which is what we were seeing. It's a really interesting thing. So we've got to make sure every voice counts equally. You need, in a complex space, context and detail. Because remember I said how small changes at the beginning can create big differences at the end? We've all had this of, there are certain days we do the same thing, but actually depending on how we got out of bed and how the process of getting into work was, we may come in with a different attitude from other days. And try as we can be to be professional, that will have an impact. So, the context and detail really matters. Personal perceptions matter in complexity. Okay, my telling you this is the way it should be depends on how many other people have told you something similar and what you thought of them. Depends on what narrative you already had running about me. So, I'm British. I can be English if I'm watching cricket, but otherwise I tend to be Scottish. Okay. It's a very important distinction. It took my kids a long time to learn. Particularly Scottish if I'm watching rugby. I know nobody here will be interested in that, but it's a very important thing, and it is one of the greatest games ever. When we went out, one of our first projects, we went to Pakistan. We were working with the British Council. And the British Council gave us a warning as we went out, saying you have to be really careful. In Pakistan, people hate the UK. You know, they hate the US slightly more, but it's 92% versus 89%. It's not a good thing, whatever we do. We said, okay, well, why do they hate us? And standing in Nairobi, it's exactly the right place. As a Brit, we've been most places in the world and done things that, frankly, we should be ashamed of. So, their assumption was colonial legacy, all the Raj, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, can I test it? We're being tested, but we'd rather you didn't. But we did. So we put in material, and we had them collecting material around Raj. So we had a picture prompt rather than a question. And one of them was a very evidently British Empire style colonial thing. And we had young people telling us stories in response to the picture. None of them, no, that's not true. We had 200 stories, two mentioned the British Empire. The others were all completely different. When we looked at the results, yes, many people, particularly adults in Pakistan, distrust the UK. Okay? And there are some for whom our colonial history is a part of that. But that's actually quite a few. It's much more the fact that we tend to ally ourselves with India. So their perception is absolutely about India versus Pakistan. Which side do you sit on? That matters more than anything else. Or it did at that point with the many other people we were talking to. Now even that is too causal for my liking. It's not as blunt as that, but it was one of the dominant factors we could see. It was different from our perception going in. So we need to know this stuff when we're doing it. So what we need to do is to look at the overall patterns of things like those triads. Things like, we call this a stone, where you're putting a stone on the grid. We call this a dyad, and obviously it's a multiple choice question. You look at the overall patterns to get a sense of what's going on, and then you can zoom in. Now you can zoom in to say, hang on, let's have a look over here. So, I'm going to mention the initials. You don't have to raise your voice and say, oh, that's me, because until this point you are anonymous. Okay. So Ziola.js, the project they were referring to, is risky and technically difficult. Okay. Before I even look for JS here, I might look for JS over here. So was that project about advocacy? Was it about research? I can look at multiple different dimensions of this. One of the things that happens when we build the triangles, you put a dot on it, we get a measure against all three corners that we can then run stats on. I say we. I'm clearly not the stats guy. I wish I was, and I keep beating myself up for not knowing more about it, but I read things like, yes, we ran this, and we did Spearman's coefficients on this, and I go, that's lovely, I understand all of those individual words. I have no idea what they mean when they put together that order, but that's okay.
It's okay, that's the theme of this workshop.
So, if I have a triangle A, B, and C, and I put a dot there, okay, it goes A, for this one, equals 0, B equals 100, and C equals 0 again. So if I put a mark there, A equals 50, B equals 0, and C equals 50. And I can run all sorts of stuff off the back of that. And having listened to Stephen yesterday, I'm thinking, I am so at the shallow end of the pool on how I can use this data. So, the thing about complexity is, it's very difficult to hunt for the cause. It's very difficult to interpret the narratives. I think the stuff we were talking about yesterday, things like Watson, is a brilliant start if you can. Okay? If the approach we take is we have humans at the front telling us what their story means. And there's a couple of reasons for that I'll talk about in a second. Then we have humans at the end, because I don't want to spit out an answer that goes, your answer is this. No. I want people like you, experts in the room, and ideally beneficiaries, and other stakeholders, other people involved, going, when I see that triangle, oh, it means this. So we've just had one in Jordan that said, we discovered that in Jordan, survival day-to-day is priority 1, obviously. Priority 2 is gaining some sense of status in your community, and that will eventually lead to prosperity. Now, the government program that's going on is to try and improve the local economies. So they've been going, do this and you'll make more money, because they think that improves the local economy. And everybody in Jordan goes, that's just greedy. Now, in plenty of countries, yes, prosperity is your route to status, but not in Jordan, it's the other way around. So we need people looking at it at the end to help make sense of it. But automation in the middle is brilliant. That's where we can automate a whole lot of stuff, where we can run stats, all sorts of things. But it's not going to produce you, the answer to the problem is 3.2. Just not going to happen. Is this making sense so far?
Yeah.
Is anybody at 0 so far? And the thing also is, and Joanne will talk about this shortly, but we can do simulation in complex environments using models, but it simulates what goes on. It doesn't necessarily predict it. It can predict if you're in a complicated space. If it's ordered and you know what the cause and effect is, you can predict. In a complex space like this, we can model that. There are 3 rules if you're a bird in a flock. Avoid collision, match speed with the nearest bird to you, and fly towards the center of the flock. And they can build computer models that look as graceful and beautiful as these things. But it still doesn't tell you that when they get to the mountain, are they going to go left or are they going to go right? Because that's too small, too contextual. The variables are far too little, and there's just too many of them. So modeling in complexity is really good to simulate, to explore what might happen, but it won't tell you what will happen. In a complicated environment, it would. Okay, so when we're doing all of this, when we're doing the signification, we call it illuminating the ambiguous, and we want some ambiguity kept in there. We don't want everybody to specify precisely what they meant when they said this, because as human beings, we don't do that. As dictionaries, we might, and lots of people I know, and I I speak as somebody who, I was an electronics and computing engineer at university, and for about a year afterwards until I realised I was really, really bad at it. At which point I got out and did something different. But in that world, everything has to be specified. We need to understand completely, and we don't like that. What we're looking to do here, why do they do what they do? A lot of big data can tell us what they do, and how they do it. It may not tell us why. Attitudes, culture, all of these things will help us to understand why, and hunting for a single root cause why is always going to frustrate you because it will never happen. Of course, for me, the interesting is what do we do about it? And actually, if you have micro-narratives, and I'll touch on this at the end, it's much easier to work out what your next steps are and help with decision making if you have micro-narrative data rather than just abstractions, if you're in the complex space. And many of the problems that you're dealing with are not in the complex space, but those that are, you want narrative for that. And then the other element is monitoring. How will we know if we've done it? It's one of the things we're working on in Jordan right now. We've just done the baseline. We're doing a narrative end line to see what impact the project has had on attitudes in a way that's less gameable. If you put a targeting system, sorry, I can really rephrase that better, right? If you put targets into a complex environment, people will game them. Okay? Yeah. Guaranteed. When I have two daughters, one of them is 16, one is 14. When my 14-year-old was 5, okay, I used to drive her to school every morning. And I have one of those cars that it can tell you when someone is sitting on the seat, but the seatbelt is not yet plugged in. Okay? So I put my 5-year-old into the car, I get in the front, okay, put your seatbelt on, and I can see on the dashboard, okay, seatbelt's in, okay, I drive away, there's a car coming, I slow slightly, and she falls off the seat. Wait, what? And she realised that I look and I can see the dot's gone off, so she's got her seatbelt on. She'd sat there and went, nah. So she was gaming the system. Okay? We all do it. The bigger the bureaucracy, the more people will game it. To get work done outside the bureaucracy, you've got to have informal networks to get it done properly, right? And in many cases, and there's lots of examples of this, UK Health Service, Australia is even worse, targets have well-intentioned targets in a complex environment have perverted the system to produce really negative outputs. In complexity, if you've got a big problem, you don't go after it directly. We call it obliquity. I can send you an article on that as well, don't worry. So, we also use this to get into that. In terms of why do I do narrative rather than just asking people for their opinion about what it's like, Starbucks used to do this. Starbucks used to go out to their customers and say, how do you like your coffee? And most people go, oh, I like my coffee black. And then they go, okay, brilliant. That doesn't tally with our sales figures. Now, people aren't lying. People believe they like black coffee. So they switched. They went, tell us about the last coffee you had. Ah, now I like black coffee, but that was a cappuccino. Suddenly it matches. Our opinions, our principles of how we think we behave in the world are wonderful. I am a fantastic farmer. Until I tell you about some of the things that happened at the weekend, at which point I look rather foolish. Okay? I would much rather base my interventions, my actions, my programming on what I've really done. Okay? On what happened rather than what I think should have happened. And that's what we tend to do. It's why we ask for examples, always. And then we ask you to tell us what it means, because the meaning is not just in the words. There's a lot of meaning in the words, that's why Watson is so useful. However, there are some places it isn't. Let me give you some examples. I was in Rwanda last year, working on a project. We were training up a bunch of young female mentors who were going out into the field. And about halfway through, I was sitting at the side, and I reached for a glass of water as somebody else was coming past, and it started to wobble. She and I both reached for it, it fell off and broke. Okay. The guy who was running the session at the time just went, aha, they broke the glass. And everybody fell about laughing. And I don't know about you, but when everyone else was laughing, okay, why are they laughing? And she went, because that means we're married. What? The metaphor in Rwanda is, you break the glass, it's part of what happens at the wedding ceremony. You broke the glass, you are now married. Okay, I'm going to have to find a way to break this to my wife, but we can manage it. We use metaphor all the time. Is anybody here old enough to remember, there's only a couple, obviously, and some of you will have seen it on reruns, obviously, the original Star Trek TV series? Thank you, with Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk. So if you know your Star Trek, this kind of a scenario might be familiar to you. They've been down to a planet to work with aliens. Okay? For those of you who know Star Trek, what do you know about this guy? Anything? In a red shirt.
It's evil.
Who said he's going to die? Thank you. So, in Star Trek, if you wear a red shirt and you go down to the planet, you have a one-way ticket. You're not going back. If you're in that culture, the phrase red shirt is an assessment of life expectancy. Yesterday for Sabrina was obviously an exception. I'm hoping. But red shirt can mean different things in different places. In Italy, it would refer probably to Garibaldi. Great moments of significance in politics. In other places, it's politics. In the UK, it means you support the wrong football team. So red shirt is something I've seen in people's stories. We did a project with Intel. There was a micro-narrative that said this guy interrupted the meeting, but he was a complete red shirt, so we ignored him. Okay. Now that works really well for shorthand. But if you take it out of that context, it becomes a problem. Now, my 14-year-old daughter's realized I use this. She's a geek, so she started sending me pictures. So this is Captain Kirk. But there is also in the US, there is a healthcare company that has billboards out by highways, by the motorways. Oops, sorry, there you go. That works really well as long as you're not in Star Trek. For a healthcare company, they really needed to rethink. And you will find the same. We found it in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, I had a project on latrines. I was working with some colleagues from the Netherlands, from IRC, and one of the stories came back and said, yeah, getting this latrine installed was a real leg break problem. Leg break. Okay, so the Netherlands guys were going, somebody broke their leg putting a latrine in? Or did they have to break a few legs to get it put in? Now, the Bangladesh guys and I had some conversations earlier, and they went, he'll understand. Okay? I watch cricket. In cricket, there is a way of bowling the ball called a leg break, which is really tricky, because it bounces and then spins off in a different direction from what you'd anticipated. That was what they meant, but it wasn't evident to anybody reading. So metaphor is a huge thing in narrative and how we talk. And if you're not from that culture, and you don't understand it, and some of it is very local, you won't get the meaning of that. The other thing that comes in then is sarcasm. We mentioned this briefly yesterday. A quick example. This is a story we collected in Pakistan in response, believe it or not, to a picture that's behind here of two children sitting on potties. The story says, effectively, these two children are playing with each other the way my government plays with the Taliban. He went on for 2 pages. The sooner we have proper Sharia law, the sooner we'll get rid of corruption and conflict and all sorts of things. Okay. Occasionally when I'm feeling mischievous, I'll put this up at conferences where I'm talking with NATO, with people who are military or the State Department or NATO. And their first reaction is always, do you have his address? Because you read that and you think, this is somebody who looks like they're becoming somewhat radicalized, right? Except, the meaning is not in the words, but we've just put huge meaning in those words, as we always do. I had various questions, so there's one over there about how do you feel about this story? The version I had here was, do you feel angry? Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel, various emotions? And he just went, I'm not bothered. Wait, you've written that the government are playing with terrorists and you're not bothered? What? There's another question we ask, which is, who should hear this? Everybody should hear this. My leaders should hear this, my community, my friends. No one in particular. And he went, my friends. Wait, what? And then I looked at the title, the headline he gave it, joke. Oh, you're taking the piss. Sorry, excuse my language. You're being sarcastic. We assume when we go out and collect data from people, they're talking to us straight. They're giving us straight answers. Okay? You and I have a sense of humor. We can be sarcastic, and we know that other people will, for the most part, understand. They may be doing the same in surveys and questionnaires. My 14-year-old daughter, whenever I ask her to do things now, like put on your seatbelt, her answer is, sure. I don't know what to do with that anymore. Because I'm sure she doesn't mean it most of the time, but I can't quite bank on that. The other thing is language shifts, and language evolves all the time, but certain words have different meanings and multiple layers of meanings in different cultures. So, there was something that came out yesterday. So, one of the things was savings. Now, savings, is that about me saving money into a separate place in case I need it later? Or is it me looking for savings and discounts when I go out to buy something? Okay. Another one would be, there's a phrase that simple phrase, it means very different things to me if I'm in the US or the UK. Okay. Somebody comes up in the US and says, nice pants. I go, thank you very much. I'm glad you like them. Okay. In the UK, if somebody comes up and goes, nice pants, my reaction is, I forgot to put my trousers on again. Because in the UK, pants are what you wear underneath them. Okay. They really shouldn't be showing. Now, I don't know which it's going to be, unless I'm in the context and I understand. Okay. So when we're doing this, we have to have people to add the meaning to their stuff. Only the respondent will know what's going on. There will be many things which are relevant we can ask questions about that aren't anywhere in these stories. So quick question, show of hands. And I suspect the answer will be none, but it's okay if there's some. One of the questions here said, in the story, the example, data will be used for advocacy, research, monitoring, and evaluation. Did anybody have research, advocacy, or monitoring and evaluation as words anywhere in what they wrote down? A few. Excellent. But you can see how if we were just running an algorithm across it, we're putting it into Watson, we might not pick that up. We might, if we're using concepts, we might see comparisons, but we wouldn't necessarily. Okay. So there's lots of layers of meaning we can dig into that aren't apparent in the minor narrative. We want to deprivilege the expert. If we have time, I will show you some stories I took from Ethiopian girls, and I gave them to UNDP experts in gender and said, please, would you look at these stories and place them on the triad the way the girls in Ethiopia did? And then we were really sneaky and we compared the results. And there were some things they were pretty good on, and there were some things they really weren't. As experts, we will always bring our patterns to that and reinterpret. Quite often, we'll get it wrong. Well, when I say wrong, we'll get it different. It doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means we see the world differently. And if we're assuming they see the world the same as us, we have a problem there. So, if I had put this up, you know what answer I'm looking for, right? One of the problems always with questionnaires and things, people will see that and they will either game it or they will gift. Usually they will gift, particularly if they see you as a benefit, as somebody who will help them. I wanted to give you something that will help you because you may help me. We've seen this in the field. In India, we did a project for a commercial client. Said, would you recommend this company on a scale of 0 to 10? And 85% of people went 10 or 9. Yeah. And then we said, and on triangle, we asked them effectively the same question. And 15% of the people who said 9 or 10 also said, I would never recommend this company, they're crap. Yeah. But the thing is, the first one, people can see what you're after. The minute they can see what you're after, you have a problem. It's why instead we might use something like this. And something like those triads, where there is no right answer. They're all good answers. Anything works. And then the distribution of dots on that gives us the information we need. Yeah? It's a different way of getting the data. It cuts out some. You can never cut out all of us, but it starts to cut out some of the biases. Now, for anyone who's got an iOS device, or I hesitate to say an Android as well, there are apps that we use in field that do offline, that collect voice or collect pictures and have people signify them into tryouts, that then allow us to look at the patterns and compare maybe the patterns between two different groups, or compare what links from this corner here to another corner somewhere else. We keep seeing this as a correlation or an association. What does that tell us now? Let's dig deeper into those. The other thing about this is, I said up front, you could write it in any language you like. It doesn't matter the language you use. It doesn't matter if we're collecting it in audio, because do you know what? Most of the stories, most of the micronarratives may never be read, because we'll base our analysis and our insight on where we work on this level first. And then we may go and select particular micronarratives that we think, hang on, there's a cluster here that look really odd. I want to understand what's going on about these. And then we might translate those. In Bangladesh, we collected 500 about latrines, and we translated 19 to explain particular issues. It's a very different world. So this is one from Libya. Anybody speak Arabic? Excellent. I thought it. Obviously. So I have no idea what it says, but it doesn't matter, because that person had a triangle that said, what kind of justice is in your story? Justice, another one of those great words that we all believe in and we all think is slightly different. Hugely cultural. So they looked at this one, they said, okay, my story sits around about here. And then everybody else tells stories. One story is not enough. We need much more data than that, but we can't read many more. We know as human beings, you read 3 stories, you've already come up with a hypothesis, you're patterning, and you're into confirmation bias. Very, very quickly. Which is why I fight people who want to read the stories early on. So, here we have nearly 2,000 different micronarratives. Just looking at that, what's the dominant form of justice in this country? Revenge. Yeah. Some of you can see it's a little faint, but there's colours on that as well, green and red. So you remember you had, how do you feel about your story, from very positive to very negative? I colour-coded them. So the green ones are the ones I feel good about. The red ones are the ones I feel bad about. Which makes this worse. Because do you know what? There's a lot of green up here on revenge. I like revenge. We feel good about revenge in this culture. On the other hand, there's a lot of red ones down here around the terrorists. So we don't like stopping people in advance doing things, making crimes, all the rest of it. But on the other hand, once they've done it, hello, we like that. And there were examples here of, I was standing in the queue in the bread shop, a guy came in and robbed the owner, we all just kept out of it. Wait, what? You know, you start to get that kind of a picture of the culture. But remember I said how the micro-narratives are always behind the dots? It means that if we go, okay, what we want in here is, there's a real lack of this. So let's have a look at existing examples of the behavior we want that people feel good about. So let's look at good examples of reconciliation, and we can pull out 170 examples of reconciliatory justice from the culture.
But I'm also making assumptions by sort of saying that there are 3 possible concepts of justice. Because, for example, in Uganda there was research done on how, for people, their conception of justice depends on who the person was concerned, what position the person had in the community. So for some people out of the community, revenge was the right answer, and for someone who were very close to the community, reconciliation was the right answer. So
absolutely, yeah. So funny enough, in terms of coming back to the first point about the 3 concepts, it's part of the design process whenever we're building, is to work out what is it we need to be looking at here. A number of these we've taken from anthropology, from core anthropology. That one actually we got from the Tutu Foundation. They said, you know, basically every form of justice is a combination of these 3 things in different proportions. And you're right about your status or what your role is, which allows us to go, okay, I could look at all of these ones up here and say, what are characteristics of the people who are here? What are the characters, is it they're mostly male, and the ones down here are mostly female? I don't know. But I can start to explore that to see different levels of education, different role in the community, whatever else, for exactly that reason. You're right. And so, for me, this is your top level. Okay, interesting questions. And then we start to drill down to dig deep. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through the next couple relatively quickly. We do gathering through a number of routes. We've done it through Colombian entrepreneurs. Singapore, we have citizens who keep journals on a regular basis. We did that for Horizon Scan. We're increasingly using people who have field notebooks and keep their notes into SenseMaker that gives them access later, but also gives us. And there are confidentiality issues, so that some of these things, we only look at the patterns, we never look at the micro-narratives. But you get to see the patterns that are emerging out of a whole lot of different areas. And in Rwanda, we're building it into mental groups. This is my friend Aurora. Aurora is one of a team of 6 that I trained a couple of years ago in Rwanda. Aurora is just fantastic. There's her, there's Jolie, Sandrine, Chance. She's using an iPad. This was the first field test of the iOS app. She hadn't heard ever about SenseMaker or complexity or anything else until 4 o'clock the previous day when I talked a bit about how we're going to do it. We then gave them a paper version of the questionnaire. We gave them an app version of the questionnaire. We had 3 of each for the 6 of them. And said, right, go into the office and collect a story. At that point, everybody's fighting for the paper because nobody wants to touch this thing that, frankly, what do you do with it? It's a bit confusing. I'm going to break it. I'm not touching it. Okay. The next morning, we were driving out to this school, and they're all fighting over the iPads because now we've got the hang of it. It's brilliant. And she has turned out to be phenomenal. One of the things we found in Rwanda, which a lot of the communities they're going to have done many surveys, many questionnaires, and they would sit down and go, give us an example of something significant that's happened to a girl in your community recently. And the girl's response, because they're experienced interviewees, is, well, what kind of stories are you looking for? Because there's got to be a hypothesis, right? There's got to be a theory and a reason why you're doing this. And they go, whatever story matters to you. Seriously? Yeah. And what's been coming out, not always, a lot of really useful other material, but there are a significant number of taboo stories that have not been told before, that the girls have never felt able to share before, are coming out of this. Because it's whatever matters to me. And that becomes really significant. So, in essence, what we're doing here is we're giving everybody a voice, everybody an equal voice. But we're digging into attitudes, perceptions, cultural and behavioural elements that aren't necessarily evident from standard questionnaires and standard polls. If you put your trust in polling, I'd like to point you to 2 major political events last year. One, I was really hopeful, would be the cautionary story for the rest of the world not to do stupid things like decide to leave Europe. But sadly, it didn't seem to be quite enough of a cautionary story. So now everybody else, and I'm looking at my colleagues in France and Germany this year in particular, we have another even bigger cautionary story. Please pay attention to that one. And the polling in both cases did not indicate what the result was going to be. Because people were embarrassed, or for whatever reason, the polling was off. And that's an experience we've seen everywhere. In Iraq, do you support the government? Yes. You have an election. Hang on, what? You said you supported them. Well, of course I did. You were asking me a straight question. It was a nice person in the street. I didn't want to offend them by saying, I'm trying really hard not to swear here. I get very passionate, and when I get passionate, I swear. And we're increasingly using it for monitoring and evaluation. Because remember I said how you can take those measures off the corners? If I want to see more in one particular corner, I can use that as a simple statistical measure. And when I'm designing the interventions, when I'm coming up with how to make a better decision about this, how do I do it, we have found that if you tell people what do we do to create better deterrence in your community, they all interpret the word deterrence and come up with, oh, hang on, it's standard stuff. In a complex environment, what is more effective when we're running, say, workshops to come up with interventions is to give people a set of stories, 2 sets of stories. One that we have chosen to say, these are not good, and one that we have chosen to say, these are good. Like reconciliation versus revenge. And we say, what kind of thing would you do? What projects would you run that would generate more stories like these and fewer like those? And you don't tell them why you've chosen them. And from that, as human beings, we are much better in a complex environment navigating by narrative. I can go, yeah, we could do things like this and this and this, which when you take their suggestions away, yes, they fit absolutely what our objectives are, what impact we're looking for. But we didn't give them that as the instruction. Because if we do, they will start to game the gift. Because it's what we do as human beings. And that's the thing about all of this. It's not looking for the perfect Homo economicus. It's working with the flawed, fantastic, evolved over thousands of years people that we are and that we're working with. And better to work with that than thinking, I wish they would answer these questions straight. No, they answer how they answer. Now let's work with what we've got. And that's what we do with the complexity and the sentiment. So, I can talk for hours more, but I will not, because frankly, if you're not already in the lower half of that 10, you're probably in need of coffee. So I recognise that, so I'll call it there, but I am very happy. The slides will be coming out to everybody afterwards, including some of the ones I've missed. But I will stop. At lunch, I need to pop back to the hotel to check out, but then I'm coming back quickly. So coffee, lunch, beer afterwards. I've got to leave for the airport with some of the team later on. Happy to talk, happy to have questions.